One. Right, guys, welcome back to the Adam Peter Fitness Podcast. Today on the show, I have Dr. Chester Sokolowski. Did I get that right?
You got it
Sokolowski.
right. Yeah, man. People just say
Hell yeah.
Soko. But yeah, you got the whole thing.
I got it correct. So I'm happy about that. But Chester has a lot of really, really good content on his Instagram page. If you guys don't follow him, he's Dr. Soko. Tons of really good informative content. And the thing that I really resonated with a lot was his topic about volume. And he really, caught my attention with that because a lot of what he was talking about we're talking about volume for training. There's a lot of different research on it recently. It's kind of always been a hot topic, especially recently in bodybuilding, and I think also in powerlifting too. Volume has also been something that has been put to the extreme ends of being very, very high on lots of cases. And Dr. Sokolowski was talking about how, his own experience with doing actually quite low training volume. Like I believe in your last update about what your training was like, you're doing like 5 hard sets on average per week per muscle group, and you're like 250 pounds or something like that, jacked. And so that was something that I really, I think that seeing somebody like Chester, who is clearly, I think one of the coolest things about him is that he is actually in the trenches doing the thing, and he also has the brains to back it up. I think we're talking about evidence-based fitness. That's really what we're talking about, is you just taking what the research suggests, keyword suggests, and then applying it to your own practice based off of what you have seen. So I know it's kind of a long ramble, but that was sort of how I found you.
Yeah, yeah. And it's great to be here. And then my background is I got a PhD from Florida State and I did a postdoctoral research fellowship at Florida State as well. And I also did research during my undergrad and master's at UGA, the two-time national champion, Go Dogs. I'm definitely a Bulldog, not a Seminole. But I've had an extensive research background with about a decade of work, and I've seen a lot of different things that the public wouldn't, pick up on when they read these research studies. And I myself have carried out numerous resistance training trials, and I've seen the differences between kind of what we do in the gym in reality and then what they're doing in these resistance training trials. A real simple example is the listening to music. How would your workout be if you could not listen to music? In the real world, everyone listens to music, it hypes them up, it influences their workout. But in the research world, you can't listen to music during your training because you might play one song and person A could be fired up from it and it could affect their performance in one way. And person B, it could put them in a bad mood and it could affect their performance in a different way. So the training is musicless. And essentially you're sitting there with your research undergrad or research assistant or yourself, and you're kind of just trying to chit chatting and trying to make small talk with your research participant. So it's just not awkwardly silent. So you kind of have the no music. There's sort of that lack of sympathetic arousal that goes with that, as well as like this kind of interesting dialogue that you wouldn't really carry over in one of your workouts, which obviously, if you're trying to do something to the best of your ability, you're never going to do it when you're distracted. And that's kind of what happens because you're kind of carrying on this little side conversation about whatever the topic is, the weather, the traffic, whatever it is, you can pass the time for an hour and a half to or an hour till that session goes by that you just wouldn't do in the real world. So that's obviously going to play implications on, the set quality might not be as good. Pushing outside of your comfort zone might not be as much, but it's those little things that I have observed that I don't, discredit the research, but I certainly take it with a healthy skepticism. And like you said, it's a launching point and it's a suggestion, not the whole palette of information, live and die Bible that you should adapt your training to. It's more so the guidelines. Pirates of the Caribbean, they have guidelines. Research is more the guidelines, and you can kind of self-interpret those guidelines and auto-regulate, take notes on your body, and then put yourself on the best path for success.
Right. And I think that when it comes down to something like training volume, we said there about, there's so many things that impact performance on a set, and also the psychology of the lifter and like how skilled they are actually like pushing themselves on all of their, exercises. Because like I can say like from experience, like when I was starting out, like I kind of didn't really have that skill being able to push very hard. I didn't really know what I was doing. I also would argue like I benefit a little bit more from that technical practice that came with doing a little bit more volume. So I wasn't very good at training yet, especially like I go to a powerlifting gym, and there are some very strong people there that know how to push themselves on all their exercise, and it reflects in their physique and their performance levels. There are also some people that I look at and I'm like, what did you just do there? Like you just flapped around your arms. Like Like what, like that's why you need like 52 sets a week to like grow. And so there's always a lot of different like caveats with all of this research. But if you take a look at a lot of these really strong bodybuilders and a lot of these really strong powerlifters, especially that are more muscular, that's always been my goal. I never wanted to be like just like strong and like not look like I lift. They don't do a lot of volume. Like I'm good friends with Jared Feather, and like he does like 10 sets per week on average, like at the very high end. And a lot of times you look at these guys like Nick Walker or whatever, like they aren't doing a ton of volume. Now, obviously, you have examples of Ronnie versus Jay, who, Jay did a lot more sets and a lot more, like he also was very adamant about I was not very close to failure. And Ronnie was very close to failure. So there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat. And I think you mentioned this on the podcast with Joe Jeffrey I listened to, of like, look, like there's different ways people prefer to train. If you want to keep a little more reps in the tank, like that's fine. You can probably do a little bit more sets. If you prefer pushing yourself harder and you enjoy that, maybe do something a little bit low volume. But it just really just comes down to gauging recovery and what is actually, optimal for muscle growth. I think that I just want to ask you, because one of the things I've always thought about is the rate of like fractional, like the fractional synthetic rate of like building muscle is like very small, like even on anabolics. And I've always thought about that. I'm like, do we really like need all this volume? So like, how would you sort of gauge, am I doing enough volume based off of my own, training to actually build muscle? What are some things that you might look at with a program or from an athlete's response if you're coaching them?
Okay, so I think the number one thing that you should look for, and this is irrespective if your goal is to maximize hypertrophy or strength, so we're talking bodybuilders and powerlifters here, is you have to have an increase, a progressive overload of strength over time. When you get stronger, you're adding new contractile proteins in the skeletal muscle. Now, this is assuming you're not jumping around and doing a whole bunch of different exercises and sort of getting the neural proficiency technique on those new exercises. This is you're sticking with a program, you're sticking with the same foundational core simple exercises, and you're progressing your overload. You're habitually getting stronger on those specific exercises. That is indicative that you are building contractile proteins in those skeletal muscles. And there's going to be sort of this, it's not 100%, one-to-one linear, but there's this gradual rise in strength and size, and they go in hand. And I think a lot of bodybuilders or anyone seeking to maximize muscle growth, they sort of have this underappreciation and undervalue of their performance, of their strength. And when I was younger, I didn't record my workouts. I didn't really give a shit, how strong I was. Like, that's not my goal. But looking back, that was so incredibly foolish, because that is the indicator that my program is working, that I'm progressing as fast as possible to get as strong as possible, to increase my strength as much as possible. Because if my strength is getting faster, is increasing faster, then I'm building those new proteins, those new contractile proteins to support that strength increase in the fastest rate. And the myofibril, those contractile proteins, they take about 80 outside of water, they take about 80% of the muscle cell's volume. So the biggest contributor of the volume of the cross-sectional area of the gains, if you will, are those contractile proteins. And again, that's what you want to focus on increasing. It accounts for the most space, and it's going to give you the most bang for your buck in terms of consistent growth over time. And it's, again, the best indicator of growth.
I think it's a really important thing about like exercise in there for like a long amount of time, because like you said, the neurological learning, can be a confounding variable when you're tracking that. Because like I think one thing these powerlifters is like, if you go from benching 300 pounds to 400 pounds, like your chest is probably going to grow. Like there's no other way around it. Like that's a signal that you're giving your body. I do think one thing that's also interesting with that though is that, every powerlifter has sort of realized this, and this is sort of like what I've come up with, is that there's always like a strength ceiling with like different muscle size or different body weights that people will sort of find. And that can also be like a cap on like how strong that you can get. So, so let's say assuming that your volume is in a spot where you said, you can actually gauge that strength over time. If you're talking about like periodizing your nutrition then to go along with that muscle growth, like how would you do that in a way that, supports that, recovery and adaptation, being able to slowly, add body weight over time, without like really getting too fat? Because obviously, I think there's two schools of thought. There is like, let's try to like minimize fat gain at all costs, and try to just really keep the surplus like minimal. And there's also the whole thing of like, let's just bulk and cut, bigger surpluses and cut more frequently. And I'm not too sure, honestly, because I cannot found any research on this. Like, if anything is better, I've seen people argue that over the long term, you end up in the same spot. But what is your experience with that?
So I think it comes back to the fundamentals. So what do you need to grow and build muscle? You need amino acids, so you need the protein, and you need energy to link those amino acids together. So you need protein and you need an energy source. And the energy source can come from essentially three places. You can have carbohydrates, you can have fats, or if you have if you're over fat, you have an excess of adipose tissue, you can break that fat down, then use the fat to sort of facilitate growth. It can provide the energy source to fuel that growth. Um, so if you have someone who's extremely over fat, they have essentially a lot of stored energy on their body, and that can fuel growth. Um, I don't really see it's advantageous to accumulate a whole bunch of body fat because if you have strategic nutrient timing, and you're getting in energy when you need to get in energy, when you're more sensitive to grow, then I think that can behoove you and fuel the growth that you need to achieve without gaining a whole bunch of body fat. And in terms of periodization, I would look at, when do you train? Because when you train, that's when you're most sensitive to break down and build mass. So during that period, you're going to need the resources to fuel that training, to avoid breaking down tissue when you're in the gym, and then to fuel the growth thereafter. So if I were to train, let's say midday, I would have sort of this curve where I'm going to have kind of a little bit lower of a calorie intake for breakfast, because I don't really need too much to I don't have like an active job or anything. I'm more of just sitting at my desk. So a baseline, a baby surplus, if you will. And then my food intake is going to go up pre-workout, and then it's going to remain elevated when I have my sort of anabolic window, if you will, post-workout. And then it might taper back down a little bit because I don't need as much nutrients. I have enough energy that I consumed post workout, and I've got a little bit of fluff for body fat, and that can kind of keep me growing as I get further and further away from my workout. Now I'm still having protein every 3 hours, but I'm not just blank aimlessly eating food, like shoveling in pizzas and waffles and all this junk food. I'm more so using timing to strategically increase my food intake when I'm most sensitive to grow. And your calorie surplus does not have to be linear. You don't have to be in, the same calorie surplus throughout the day. You might be able to be in a little bit of a deficit in the very beginning of the day. Let's say again, you're training midday, and you have some body fat. So it's kind of like a little net wash. Maybe you have a little bit of growth from your previous workouts if you're eating protein. Then you can be in a dramatic calorie surplus when you're most sensitive to break down and build tissue around that workout. Great pre-workout meal, great post-workout meal. High carbohydrates as a rapidly digesting and absorbing energy source. And then maybe you can taper that fuel intake away from your workout. But I would also like to note before bed is a great time for fats. So you're going to have protein, and I like to have fats as well because it's going to slow digestion. So you sort of get this trickle of nutrients in throughout the night. And then fats are also an energy source. So you sort of have this slow trickle of nutrients, the slow delivery of an energy source into the skeletal muscle to avoid catabolism and potentially fuel anabolism throughout the night. So I would say carbs peri-workout or around your workout, and then fats are great before bed. And that is a good idea to have a general sort of nutrient periodization over the day in order to maximize muscle growth without gaining too much body fat.
I really like what you said about how, like, there's different periods of the day where you're in a surplus, more because you're eating more food, and periods of time where you're breaking down. Obviously, over calorie balance is what matters, or the net balance. But we're talking about like those small increases in muscle mass and also like performance. It does make sense to actually pay attention to that. That was one of the things I told my clients. I'm like the anabolic window is absolutely a real thing in the sense of you are more sensitive to growth, and then as you go further away from it, it's like your body's ability to actually assimilate amino acids and maximally recover gets lower. So that makes a lot of sense. As far obviously, and then you have enough body fat, you can supply that growth. Obviously, so I'm assuming that's mostly an issue of energy availability. Correct for determining that. Is there like a certain body fat percentage for, like, I'm sure it's individual, but like as a general guideline where like you might actually be able to like use that body fat for like stored energy, like even in like a deficit to build muscle. Is like, I think that you made a really good point there of like a lot of powerlifters were like, I gotta bulk. And I'm like, no, like you gotta actually learn how to like eat. You don't need to bulk. Maybe you maximize your weight class before you move up the weight class. You like 20% body fat, but is there a certain body fat percentage threshold where you might be able to recomp and have that happen until, and then maybe you need to go into an actual deliberate surplus?
I think it might vary based on your use of PEDs. If you're going to use your androgens, your exogenous testosterone, your gear, your growth hormone, and your insulin, those can help you grow with probably a little bit less body fat. But I would say for males, maybe 10 to 15% body fat is really all you need. Um, Maybe 15 on the more conservative side to ensure you're going to have more of that growth. And then females, maybe 15 to 20, then 20% would be again more of that conservative side. But you don't need to accumulate a whole bunch of excess adiposity if your nutrient timing is very good. And again, like you can, let's say you want to say screw it and just do like this perma bulk, crazy bulk. You can have more calories further away from your workout, have mondo cheat meals, on rest days and such. It's just, and it might grow just a trivial amount of more muscle, just a little bit more muscle, but the amount of fat gain that you're going to experience with those, just because you're not as sensitive to use those nutrients to fuel the growth, to fuel the muscle protein synthesis. It's not the best return on your investment if you're trying to maximize your body composition and look and feel as best as you can at a tolerable weight. And I also think, from a health perspective, don't force feed or force yourself to get into a weight that's, essentially you're not really fitting and your musculoskeletal system cannot handle, because all the added weight, especially if it's a whole bunch of adiposity, is going to tax your internal organs and you're never going to perform or function or grow as best when you have additional stress on your internal organs. That's something that's probably a little bit overlooked. The health aspect, we talk a whole bunch about, macros and muscle and all those things, but there's also blood markers that are essential. There's micronutrients that are essential. And you want to essentially establish yourself to be the most well-regulated machine in terms of ideal body composition, ideal nutrient timing, ideal macronutrients, ideal micronutrients. And the only way to do that is record your own data, and learn your body to see what works best for you and learn, you know, did your strength increase when you were X amount of body fat? Did your strength increase when you're doing X amount of volume? Or can you pull back and see those same gains? And I feel like a lot of people, especially if they have a whole bunch of adiposity and a whole bunch of training volume, they can pull back on some of those variables and experience potentially even more growth.
Right? It's like one of the things that you've mentioned on your Instagram is like it's all about signaling with everything that we are doing and sending the proper signal based off of your goals. And like once you understand like what different inputs you can do with your environment, nutrient timing, training is like what they're kind of all signaling, it kind of becomes like very simple and predictable. I think that's the cool thing about bodybuilding and power things. Like once you understand like signals and like what you're sending to your body, it becomes a lot more easy to like not only like figure out like what works, but also troubleshoot if issues arise with your progress and finding what that limiting factor is. And then also a note of that health aspect, like since as somebody who dealt with really severe malabsorption with my gut for about 3 months this past year, like I could not make progress. I was, probably deficient of key macronutrients. Probably lost a little bit of muscle, but I got a little bit weaker. So like absolutely like that health aspect needs to be a priority of all times. And I know there's been some notes about, oh, with P ratio and, you can build muscle just fine all body fat percentages. But that point you said is like, well, there's a confounding variable of health. And if you're not healthy, you don't feel well, you're not going to be able to recover as well or perform as well in the gym in general. And we know that performance is probably number one when it comes to muscle growth, like you just said.
Oh yeah, no doubt, no doubt. And I like what you touched on signaling. And I wish more people would pay attention on signaling and understand signaling, because it's very intimidating to learn, like you mentioned FSR, the fractional synthetic rate. It's just essentially how quickly you take a pool of protein and you build. So fractional synthetic rate, muscle protein synthesis, it is, taking amino acids and then linking those amino acids together and building. So it's just a way to measure your rate of building. And people, they overlook signaling, and I think they put too much emphasis on sort of these research studies with a whole bunch of untrained people, as opposed to look at signaling data. And signaling data would simplify everything. So, for example, we have great data that says if you do one set, you can increase protein synthesis for maybe 24 hours. So you can have an elevated building capacity above resting levels for 24 hours. If you do 3 sets, you can have an elevated building capacity for over 29 hours. And then if you do sort of 5 sets, there's a plateau, if you will. So you can have this elevated building, 1 set's a little bit of growth, 3 sets is more growth, 5 sets, then you see this plateau. And then after 5 sets, really 10 sets and 20 sets in terms of doing weekly volume or volume per workout, they don't produce any more growth. But remember, with every single set you do, you're going to have increased protein breakdown. So there's a return on your investment and a plateau where more is not always better. And you could so easily see that if you just studied some signaling data. What you can also do is kind of read between the lines in the existing signaling data where we have this plateau response in protein synthesis at around 5 sets, but that was with about 3-minute rest intervals. So what if you were to take longer rest intervals? Then you might be able to increase your motor recruitment more and have higher quality sets. And if that's the case, maybe you can have this plateau in protein synthesis at 4 sets or 3 sets, or maybe even 2 sets if you do a drop set and some lengthened partials. So you mentioned Jared Feather does, 10 sets a week on the high end potentially for his volume. Well, that's not random. If you just kind of comprehend the signaling, you could see that, all right, there's sort of a plateau that could occur anywhere, maybe 3 sets if I'm really, really pushing it to maybe 5 sets, sort of that plateau in protein synthesis where there's no more potential anabolism. But then every set I do after that, there could be elevated catabolism. So then if I train twice a week and I'm doing 3 to 5 sets, then 10 sets is the maximum. It makes perfect sense. Um, and I wish people would invest more time in some of that signaling data rather than get so focused on some of these untrained studies that are honestly, they're just coming out for headlines. What do we got? Like 52 sets a week or something like that. Like at one point, does it get to where it's like we're not even trying to investigate what's truly maximal for growth? It's almost like we're just dick measuring to see how much volume we can do in one.
Yeah.
I guarantee a 60 setter is going to come out soon. It's like, what is the point of that? Like, what are you trying to prove? You're not adding to the research. No offense to whoever comes out with the 60 set. But it's like that's certainly nobody any good. Like, yeah, maybe you could say you have the most volume out of all the research studies, but that's not advancing the game in terms of performance training or our level of knowledge needed to maximize muscle growth.
Yeah, it's fine to me because like it's like this circle jerk of like let's just see how much volume we can do and like recover from and see like who works the hardest. I'm like no one gives a shit about how many this volume you're doing if you're small and weak. Like no one cares. Like focus on the end outcome. And like what you said, like there's good research and there's bad research, and you have to like look at this and be like, oh, like does this actually make sense? Like I had a podcast with Lyle McDonald where we discussed like the protein research, and he was like, well, I've talked about this for a long time, but like there's also reason to believe that like eating twice a day probably isn't optimal for like performance or like recovery or sending the signal to your body that hey, like every time that you ingest protein, there's that spike in muscle protein synthesis. It gives your body another chance to recover. I could just say from personal experience when I move my athletes from like say they're going from 2 meals to 4 meals a day, it absolutely makes a difference. Calories equated with their performance. A lot of that comes back down to what you just mentioned earlier about nutrient timing and getting that. It matters. Like these little details do matter if you're trying to eke out all the gains as possible. It's also important to not mentally masturbate too much about minutia that isn't going to contribute to most of your results. And I feel like some of the issues with like research, I understand research is meant to look at small things and try and like extrapolate, but like it can just lead to a lot of like confusion and not really move things forward and just cause more frustration in people, especially getting into fitness.
Yeah, and for whatever reason, it's like whenever you disagree with somebody about a research topic, it's like, all right, you can no longer like that person, then you have to argue, and there's like personal attacks getting launched. Like, I don't know what that's all about. Like, people need to just like healthily agree to disagree on how to maximize hypertrophy without like, throwing character shade. But it's wild what the research game has sort of gotten to within the past, 5-ish years. I feel like there's, of course, still really good studies that are coming out, especially on the muscle length data. Um, but in general, some of this stuff is just, it has sort of limited applicability and it's becoming more emotional. You never want your science to be emotional. And I feel like some of the conclusions are being emotional and the interpretations of the conclusions are becoming emotional. And that's just, it's not a good look. Um, for the consumers of the research or honestly the people producing or whoever is trying to sort of interject sort of negativity based on the scientific data.
Right. No, I completely agree there. So I guess I wanted to go a little bit into how to structure your training for muscle growth versus strength. I think kind of a lot of this comes back down to power building, and I think that there's some there can be some key differences. You had an interesting reel about doing powerlifting without downsets, and I kind of like, oh, that's like kind of similar to like what I kind of do, because I don't do a lot of specificity, and my coach is even like, yeah, we'll probably move you like once a week squatting eventually, because I'm just built like a flamingo and just not leveraged for the sport. I guess just a specific question there is like, what are some key differences when we're looking at muscle growth versus strength? Obviously, you mentioned strength is keying with like muscle growth, but like if you guys are a powerlifter versus bodybuilder, like what are some main things you look at with structuring their program?
Well, if you're going to do, probably the biggest difference would be the rep ranges and the exercise variety. So if you're a strength athlete, you have to train in lower rep ranges to get stronger. It does not, of course, that does not mean you have to, 1, 2, or 3 RM every workout. But typically, I would say your below 10 reps would be your bread and butter, and your higher than 10 reps would be for those kind of more accessory muscles that are a little bit more sensitive to like joint stress and strain, like triceps exercises, because the elbows can only tolerate so much in that regard. But I would say the rep ranges are a little bit different. With the powerlifting, to gain the strength that you need, you're going to have to obviously do those low rep ranges. And with the bodybuilding, I think it would be a little bit more beneficial to do occasionally a little bit more higher reps. I'm still more of, even though you can grow across a number of rep ranges, me personally, I do like the 6 to 12 because I think it's really easy for muscle recruitment. I think it's really good for um, sort of keeping mental fatigue at bay. Sometimes when you have to do those extremely heavy sets, they're so mentally taxing and so mentally draining. And then I also think if you do get too high of reps, sort of above the 16-ish reps, um, then it can become more so, when does your muscle fail versus when does, or a muscle get close to failure versus when does your pain tolerance sort of give out or your focus gives out. We got the ADHD society. You can only, essentially, I feel like people stop because they get bored rather than physiologically their muscle sort of gives out on them. So I feel like the 6 to 12 is sort of the bread and butter. Me personally, I do pursue some strength gains, so I'll drop it down to 3 reps as a low, and then my joints do get a little tender, especially on those elbows and sort of some of the rear delt movements. So I'll go as high as 20 reps, but I think the 6 to 12 is a base, especially for those compound lifts. And then if you want to get a little stronger, maybe 3 to 20 would be pretty good for those hypertrophy to help uh, hit some of those strength goals while still getting some good hypertrophy and also keeping joint stress a little bit lower. So the rep range is going to be different, as well as the exercise selection. So the more variety of exercises you do, the more potential muscle damage you could have. So if you're a strength athlete, that's not exactly ideal to expose yourself to all these different angles. Like, yes, it could benefit hypertrophy because you're going to stretch fibers, you're going to strain fibers a little bit differently. You could adapt from a hypertrophic standpoint to that. But if your goal is to have the best bench press possible, you want to keep the muscle damage in your chest as low as possible. That includes upper chest, all the different various regions of your chest. And to do that, you would be best off doing a very limited palette of exercises just so you have that protective effect as much as you can. The protective effect, repeated bout effect, essentially, when you do exercises over again, you're going to have reduced muscle damage. Everyone grows best when they have low muscle damage, because when you have low muscle damage, the protein that you eat is going to go towards adding new mass as opposed to repairing your old damaged existing mass. And we want the protein to eat to go towards adding new mass rather than repairing our existing current mass. But again, the more variety you expose yourself to, the more potential muscle damage you have. And again, if your goal is to be as strong as possible on one specific lift, you want to maximize the neuromuscular proficiency for that lift. You don't want to accumulate extra muscle damage not doing that lift. So you don't want to open up yourself to, a whole bunch of incline press and, mess up your upper chest region and some of your lower chest region, just accumulating more volume on a lift that's not necessarily going to help you be as strong as possible in your key lift. You want to divert as much of your volume, as much as your energy into the lifts that you really need to maximize strength on. Whereas a hypertrophy athlete, they don't necessarily need to invest all those resources in those specific lifts. They can have more of that diversity. They still would strive to keep muscle damage low, but they want to stretch and strain their different fibers at a little bit different angles to benefit from that stimulus to sort of maximize how much volume they can put on. They don't want to attack one region specifically. They want to kind of pinpoint and tat up all the various regions, maybe a little incline chest, maybe a little decline chest, maybe a little flat chest. Now, if you do incline, decline, or flat chest, you're going to recruit your whole chest and damage potentially your whole chest, but how you stretch and strain specific fibers within the chest, they're going to have a little bit different exposure based on the angle at which you attack. So that would be the key two primary differences, the rep ranges and the exercise selection. And again, for power lifters or strength athletes, don't accumulate excess muscle damage in the lifts that they're not really important to get stronger at. You want to divert all the resources you can and essentially take all the damage you can in the key resource in the key lifts that you want to maximize strength in.
I think this is really helpful information, especially for like I think block periodization has been kind of like a little like put out of the way of lots of modern powerlifting theory. But I think that like there's a lot of value in that for like just in general structuring training as a powerlifter, for example. If you're further away from competition, you're trying to go up a weight class, build some more muscle, you can employ those general principles of maximizing your muscle growth because that's probably going to be helpful, in the long term. Maybe you could actually do a little bit more volume. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but maybe you could do a little bit more volume with a little more exercise variety because you're not going to be stressing the same fibers and motor neurons the same way. And then as you get closer to like a meet or just having strength is more important, maybe you do hang out more in those lower rep ranges, you do a little bit less exercise variety and really focus on that to really maximize that neurological efficiency and minimize muscle damage because, anybody can, anybody who's done anything with strength related, it's like if you're sore, it's like you're shit. It's probably not going to be a very strong day. So I really like that as far as like power building because that's something that I think is what you would look at in most modern powerlifting programs and say this is kind of a power building sort of approach. You have your strength section of the workout with the compound movements, so it's maybe a little bit more of those lower rep ranges. Then we go into accessories. Obviously, strength is a very complex thing. It's not just like the neurological efficiency. There's also secondary characteristics of strength, such as muscle size and whatnot. I think power building is kind of meant to do that, but what do you think the validity of power building is, say, for lives? I think a lot of people, you said you have strength goals, for example. Like, how do you sort of structure that with your program? If I'm not mistaken, you're mostly a bodybuilder.
Yeah, but I think power building is the best way to body build. I mean, power building exercises are the core foundational exercises where you're going to get a whole bunch of muscle recruitment. Typically, you're going to pick exercises where you can stretch muscles or get a deep stretch, and a good deep stretch is needed to maximize hypertrophy. And they're also pretty easy exercises to track your overload in, your squats, your bench, your deadlifts. We sort of have different versions of power building as well as kind of the old school versus new school approach. So I feel like in the power lifting world, you have your squat, bench, and dead. And then the bodybuilding, power building sort of adaptation to that, we want to minimize stress. So we might not do squats. We might do Smith machine squats because it might save our back a little bit. It might be a little bit easier. It's certainly easier mentally to do Smith machine squats than real squats. And then same thing for chest. In the powerlifting world, you have your bench press, but in the bodybuilding world, you might have a plate loaded press because it can be easier on your shoulders long term, especially if you're going to incorporate some incline bench press at a higher volume, which is often done in the sort of bodybuilding hypertrophy landscape. And then there's also the deadlift. I don't think there's as much of an emphasis on the deadlift for the power building, even though it's a fantastic exercise and I think it can build a whole bunch of mass, especially in the back. I just think due to the volume, due to the drain relative to kind of the volume stimulus that you get, the fatigue and the drain of deadlifts just might not be worth it. The old stimulus to fatigue ratio. People might do RDLs, back extension, and various other heavy rows to kind of make up for the deadlift because the deadlift itself is just so draining. And I feel like a lot of bodybuilders, they're larger, but they kind of get boat raced by power lifters. So they might try to deadlift more weight than they can deadlift or should deadlift. The ego gets the best of them. Like, if you're seeing someone 250 pounds, you expect them to be pretty freaking big and move a whole bunch of weight on the deadlift. And in the bodybuilding space, that really doesn't happen too much in terms of having a unit deadlifter. So I feel like when they do it, they might try to bite off more than they can chew, and that could lead to injury in itself. And it can also elevate fatigue. So I feel like a lot of bodybuilders, instead of doing the deadlift, they do sort of other exercises to sort of compensate. But they all have the sort of, power building base with the basic exercises. It's a squat form. It might not be barbell back squats, but it's a Smith machine squat or a hack squat or leg press. It might not be bench press, but it's a chest press or an incline chest press. The plate loaded work is great because you can minimize joint stress. And the deadlift, they might not do conventional or sumo deadlifts, but they're going to have more of an emphasis on RDLs. They might do some back extensions to help develop the erectors, and then the rows. And they probably plate loaded or cable, maybe dumbbell, probably not so much barbell row because that's going to increase fatigue quite a bit. But I do think that power building is the best way to format a program that's going to maximize hypertrophy. You're just going to get basic foundational lifts. They're going to recruit a lot of muscle, and it's very easy to track your overload on those lifts over time.
Yeah, so I think that like fatigue is one of those things where like if you look at more like the bodybuilding, like it's like what they're saying in there, it's like fatigue is like a bad thing. It's like it's not a bad thing. It's a byproduct product of effective training. You just have to manage it. Because like if you already got no fatigue, like no fatigue would be me sitting in my apartment, laying down in bed, eating potato chips all day. No fatigue, I would not get any gains. And I think if you're able to operate, for example, like on heavier compound movements, to have a little bit more fatigue, but also have a lot of stimulus. Maybe you just are a little bit closer, sorry, a little bit further away from failure than you are in more of those isolation type of movements. And that's sort of how you can, manage that fatigue a little bit better. I also like what you said about lots of bodybuilders thinking about like this is so hard. Because I'm like, dude, you're going like RPE like 9, 10, like every single session. Like that's why you're getting such like fatigue. Like, most powerlifters, like they would not powerlift if that was how they were totally, that's how you have to get stronger. Thankfully, you don't need to. We get a lot of that, as long as a lot of that maximal motor unit recruitment, as long as you're training with maximal like intent with like as fast as possible. So as far as like we know that exercise selection does matter for like volume too. There's lots of different things that affect volume, but for power building program, for example, if on your app, which is fantastic, shameless plug. I've looked at it, and for you, it's like roughly like 8 sets like per week, like if like a power building program. Or there's like some guidelines, someone's like trying to like structure their program with like power building, as you just said, in your opinion, this is quote unquote optimal. What would you put for like volume for most people like starting out at?
So starting out is quite interesting, because if you're if you have like a true beginner, you're gonna have elevated muscle damage. And if you're a true beginner with elevated muscle damage, I'd probably put you at a little bit lower volume, and I might even increase your frequency, just so you kind of gain movement technique and movement proficiency. So a true beginner is a little bit different in terms of weekly sets. It would be a little bit higher rep, less stress in that regard. Frequency, maybe 2 to 3 times a week. So you kind of get that neuromuscular proficiency. And then the volume in terms of sets per week, it could vary anywhere from, different muscle groups. Maybe like 4 on the very low end, and then on the higher end, maybe 6, or excuse me, maybe like 10-ish. So 4 to 6 on the low end, and then a high end, maybe 10-ish. And then as you gain training experience, you learn how to push yourself a little bit further. You become a little bit more resistant to muscle damage. And if that's the case, me on the low end of volume to maximize growth, I'd probably stick someone at, maybe 4 sets per week, to start with. And you can auto regulate that. You could drop it down, or obviously it could go up. And on the high end, it might go into that, 8 to 10-ish range. And then that again comes back to your signaling data, where you can have that sort of plateau in protein synthesis at around 5 sets. So if you're doing something twice a week, 10 sets per week seems like a good high end. If you're pushing yourself, if you're taking sets to, probably at least a true RPE 8. And especially if you're doing any sort of finishers, drop set finishers, that might also be a difference. We talked about training differences between powerlifting and bodybuilding. The drop set finishers and the length and partial finishers, that would be highly advantageous for a bodybuilder. But for a strength athlete, if your goal is to maximize strength, you don't need to essentially do those, because you would probably focus on more development of type 1 muscle fibers with the drop sets and the length and partials near failure. and that those type 1 muscle fibers are not going to help you move a greater absolute load. Therefore, you would gain mass without like an equally good strength benefit. And obviously, if you have a weight cap sport, that's not going to be advantageous. Um, but I think, bodybuilders and powerlifters would both benefit from sort of this general power building status or training approach. And the volume for neither one of them, I think to start with, needs to exceed 10 sets per week.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people, especially in the strength world, might be like, "Oh my God, that sounds like not a lot," because you'll see these really high frequency programs a lot of times in a very high volume. I think people need to remember like there's a difference with that sort of volume. Is like lots of times it's very like low RPE. I don't want, but like one of the things with that is like it's not. I've always wondered like, are you actually getting much out of that? Like, are you actually getting that much like neuromuscular proficiency? A lot of people say, "Oh, I just need like the practice and more volume," but it's just like like what you said, you're getting more and more fatigue with that. And maybe if you restructure your training a little bit differently, a lot of powerlifters don't do accessories. And it's like if you could push yourself closer to failure, you'll probably get a very high quality stimulus that way too. You mentioned fiber types in that. And like, is there a way to actually like train fiber types? Obviously, we have like those intermediate fibers, and I know that those can change like over time, potentially, especially if you're training more often. Like that's one a goal, like a peaking phase to get good at, singles. Is that like after something that you can train for, to something that's more like a genetic predisposition? Because, for example, like myself, I've always gotten a lot of muscle damage like in my chest, and like just always, I'm not do a lot of volume there. Or my hamstrings. Like my hamstring volume is literally like outside of my deadlift work, like I do 2 sets of leg curls per week, and I'm sore and cramping. I'm assuming that's more like type 2 muscle fiber, but is there actually a way to change that, or is it like a genetic predisposition?
So everybody has a genetic predisposition in terms of the amount of type 1 versus type 2 fibers you have, but there can be fiber shifting. The human body is a machine at adapting. So if you're always training one specific way, you can adapt and have fiber shifts, either go to more type 1 fibers or more type 2A or more type 2X fibers based on the specific stimulus you're consistently giving yourself. I would strongly recommend, regardless of whatever genetics you have, to strive for more of those type 2 fibers because they're naturally bigger and they have a higher capacity for growth. So you're going to get a whole bunch more return on your investment, sort of that ROI, if you're training still a little bit heavier as opposed to those super, high rep sets that are maybe more so targeting the type 1 fibers. And maybe, once fatigue is hit, then you might be able to recruit some of those type 2 fibers. I think it would be extremely advantageous. Once again, I mentioned that 6 to 12 rep range, that lower rep range, the heavier weight, the more emphasis on higher intensity, that would benefit people greatly to hit those type 2 fibers, which are the most sensitive to growth in terms of the muscle fiber types. In terms of damage in the different muscle groups, um, that can have a lot of variation. And obviously, the exercise selection that you do is going to dramatically affect that. If you spend more time under tension in a lengthened position, so maybe you get deeper stretches and you hold that position a little bit longer on certain muscles, that could trigger more damage in that area. If you do more isolation work, that might be able to trigger more damage in that area. For example, the biceps are hypothesized to be one of the most sensitive muscles to damage. So just a little bit of bicep curls that can really hurt your biceps compared to, maybe a whole bunch of lunges that might not hurt your quads as much because you're distributing some of that load. Now, granted, if you get super hyped up in some really heavy squats, you can still, mess your quads up pretty good. But sort of on a sort of load distribution basis, the isolation exercises may potentially cause more muscle damage to certain muscle groups, just because, again, all that load is diverted into the working muscles as opposed to spread or dispersed. They've done a few research studies on power lifters, and it's wild. Seemingly, chest frequency is the highest. Um, and I can maybe understand that a little bit because squats and deadlifts are just so draining mentally that you can't do it. So from a psychological perspective, it kind of makes sense. Chest bench press is a little easier to do. But from a physiological perspective, they found that the chest is potentially most susceptible to damage compared to the other muscles involved in the squats and the deadlifts. And they found that the chest recovery could have been the slowest. And that kind of makes sense because if you look at the exercise of the bench press, most of that load is going to your chest. Whereas, the squat, it's a healthy portion on the quads, of course, but you have some glutes, you have some erectors, you have various muscles to facilitate that lift. And same goes with the deadlift. The deadlift they found was the exercise that was almost easiest to recover with. It might be the hardest mentally to do to get up for it because it's so daunting and so heavy and so taxing. But from a physiological perspective, the back musculature and the muscles involved, they displayed the lowest sort of markers of damage post-exercise. So exercise selection is going to play a critical role in how much damage each muscle gets and how much volume each muscle can receive.
Right, and that's mostly correlated to like lengthened the position, right? Like a longer muscle lengths, more damage. And most
Yeah,
of the times,
most
if you're having like
yeah.
hamstrings and like biceps, it's like these long ass muscles that are getting stretched.
Yeah, they've
Um,
also hypothesized that pull muscles are more susceptible to damage than push muscles. And that probably just goes back to your everyday activities. You're probably more using push muscles in your everyday life. You know, think about walking upstairs with your quads, maybe lifting things overhead with your shoulders, pushing things with your chest. You're probably just doing those activities more to give those muscles maybe a little bit more of a protective effect compared to your pull muscles. I mean, how often are you doing like an RDL with strict form or a strict form bicep curl or like a lat pull down in real life, and it's probably not a lot. Therefore, you might not have as much of a protective effect, and those pull muscles might be a little bit more susceptible to damage than those push muscles.
right, that's a great point. I think one other thing to consider, like mentioned, like the chest thing. A lot of powerlifters, like they're like it's powerlifting technique is about maximizing external load and getting that mechanical efficiency as high as possible with your movement. People like barely like have any stretch on the chest. I think that's also why you'll see those higher frequency programs usually with those people that have the very short range of motion on that. Same with like deadlifting um, and whatnot. So there's always different factors to consider. But I think that's an interesting topic with like volume too. Is like you have a longer range of motion, more stretch, wherever you're going to not be able to tolerate as much. It's like that's one of the reasons why, for example, if somebody's like, oh, I can do more volume on like a leg extension than I can with like a leg press. It's like, oh, it makes sense because you're not having that big stretch. And obviously, there's ways to modify the exercise, but I digress. I wanted to sort of finish things off by talking about sort of like the importance of getting blood work in general for maximizing health and long-term improvements into the sport. So like what you can sort of learn from it because I believe you just launched a telehealth company, so I wanted to sort of delve into that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Vitality Telehealth is my telehealth company, and we can do lab work in all the states except New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. Those are the three states where like lab work is just extremely difficult. But I think everyone should get lab work, regardless if you're enhanced or natty, because everyone needs to, in order to adapt in the fastest way, you need to be your healthiest self. It's unfortunate. I kind of look at social media and I see a whole bunch of people focus on macronutrients, but not a lot of micronutrients. And micronutrients are antioxidants. They're going to determine how you feel, how well your body operates and functions. And they're, in addition to the macronutrients, they're essentially equally as important. Macronutrients are just nutrients you need in a large abundance. Micronutrients are still very important nutrients. You just don't need them in as large of quantity. That's why they're micro instead of macro. But their importance is not micro. Their importance is still macro. And I feel like a lot of people don't understand that. And then if they're not prioritizing those, they're going to see that on their blood work. Whether it be low vitamin D or, B12 is out of whack, red blood cells are out of whack, maybe glucose regulation, insulin is out of whack. And those are going to be key elements that are going to impact somebody in terms of their performance. Another big item is the lipids, especially if you're an enhanced athlete. You could see really high LDLs and ApoB, and it might not affect you more so in your 20s, but when you get in your 30s and 40s and you want this longevity in terms of not only performing, but also feeling your best, like you really need to pay attention to that. Another element that some people really sadly don't pay attention to is their blood pressure. Blood pressure is, going to be your endothelial health and your function. If you essentially don't pay attention to your blood pressure in your 20s and 30s as a male, your risk of erectile dysfunction in your 40s and 50s is going to be dramatically elevated. And, that kind of gets people to cue in. It's like, well, I don't really care about it now, or maybe I don't care about it long term because I don't care about cardiovascular disease, but I want my dick to still work, and I feel like that more so captures people's interest. So it's however you can connect the dots to convey the importance. that taking blood pressure and getting blood work, regardless if you're enhanced or natty, is absolutely vital to how you perform today and then the longevity success of your not just like lifting career, but your life.
Right. I like what you said about the micronutrients, because like, if you are devoid of that, you are going to notice it in one way, shape, or form, and your health is permissive of that performance. That's something I heard from Broderick Chavez, and it's just been like, oh, that's a really good way to put it. And just looking over everything with your health and making sure you are just healthy and individual, just for long term sustainability. And then I think like natural or enhanced, obviously, enhanced athletes is a little bit more important, but like, I think the main difference there is like frequency of lab work, because I will say as somebody who gets frequent lab work done, I learn way more about my health than I do going to the doctor and they tell me to turn left and cough. So it's definitely worth it.
Yeah, you'll not grab. Yeah.
Yeah.
Frequency of lab work, the absolute kind of minimum we do would be biannually, so 2 times per year. But I certainly think that increasing the frequency to it depends what your budget is. For me, I like to get lab work probably every 6 weeks personally. It depends again what your budget is because the lab work can certainly get expensive. Maybe if you're looking for like a healthy medium, maybe every 3 months, especially if you're doing cycles. If you're doing cycles, I would get lab work, kind of at your normal base, we'll call it your TRT, as well as when you're blasting. Like, let's see the differences. And maybe when you're blasting, let's try to address some of those differences and make them not as bad. Let's keep your high points a little bit more moderate in terms of, potential LDL and things like that. And I feel like being open and forthright with doctors would help tremendously. And also, I think the telehealth game is extremely important because when you go to your doctor, your local doctor, you might not be seeing your best, endocrinologist who specializes in athletes. You're just going to kind of see what's available. But when you have the telehealth game, you can see the best person who does specialize in athletes, who does know those. And I think there's like really easy markers to see. For example, liver enzymes. If you're a lifter, your liver enzymes are probably never within a normal range. But is that necessarily a bad thing? How high are they? What other tests can we check to see if the liver is functioning well? And then having liver enzymes in the 50s or maybe 60s, that's not really the end of the world. I mean, mine have been cranked up at that level as well as many other lifters for years, and the liver's still functioning fine. But if you go to, your primary care physician, they might, oh my God, red flag, but there's really nothing you can do given your lifestyle, given how you're going to release creatine kinase and have that linear association between creatine kinase and kind of that indirect marker of muscle damage and elevated liver enzymes. So the telehealth game and using the resources you have available. And again, once you have telehealth, they become way more available because you're not just going to get the best doctor in your 20-mile region, you're going to get the best doctor in your country to fit your individual needs. You can also be really open and forthright with that doctor. Openness is very key, regardless if you're enhanced or natty. Don't try to kind of self-diagnose or learn from Instagram. That can be dangerous in terms of the what's pushed in terms of the medical advice. It would be better off kind of like how you use research. Get those suggestions, then do your independent research, and then consult with your medical physician, and then put yourself on the path forward to optimize your health. And again, blood work, I would say at least every 3 months, potentially if, push comes to shove, every 6 months, worst case, worse, would be extremely advantageous to monitor.
Right. And that's a great point about seeing a specialist, because most physicians that you go to see are just general practitioners. And that's great for general lifestyle people, but you're not the average person. That's if you're lifting weights and you're healthy and you're jacked, or you're striving to be healthy, you're not the average, because the average is unfortunately unhealthy right now. So, Dr. Sogo, I really wanted to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you and learn from you. If people want to follow you or hire you, or use, like, you have a lot of stuff going on, so I'll let you talk about that right now.
Yeah, well, you could just simplified version is you can find me on Instagram at dr_soko. And I do have an app where you can track your workout performance. And there's also a whole bunch of training programs. They're probably controversial training programs because I do have powerlifting programs without back down sets. I know that's controversial in the powerlifting world. I also have my Physique U hypertrophy course. So if you want to learn more about that signaling, if you want to learn more about how to grow muscle, maximizing skeletal muscle hypertrophy, minimizing muscle damage, achieving the fastest, most efficient physique transformation, there is my hypertrophy course. And then I also have that telehealth company, and we specialize in TRT. So that's obviously testosterone replacement therapy. We can do prescription support. Then we have lab work throughout 47 of the 50 states in the United States.
Yeah, so obviously he has a lot going on, but he's pretty well qualified to handle all those things. So I'll make sure I include all those details and links to that in the show notes. And you guys for listening to the podcast. Talk to you guys in the next episode.